I've only read a couple of books by Ernest Hemingway at this point. I have read The Sun Also Rises, which was my first book by him, and then I read The Old Man and the Sea, probably about 10 years ago at this point, and then I finished A Farewell to Arms earlier this year. I think back in February, maybe early March, is when I finished Farewell to Arms, and I didn't like it. I mentioned that I, quote, I think fucking hated it when I was doing my Talisman review. My opinion still holds up exactly to that. I still really don't like the book. I wasn't going to get back to reading any more Ernest Hemingway. I figured I was going to be done with him until I decided to finish out the entirety of Dan Simmons. Because of Dan Simmons, I decided to pick up more Ernest Hemingway. I decided to read, first of all, his short story, A Clean, Well-Lighted Place, and it was alright enough that I decided, alright, shit, why not? We'll give some of his longer literature a shot. So, I tried Farewell to Arms, and I fucking hated it by the end of it. Reading through it, through the middle of the book, it was just fine. I enjoyed it for the most part. I don't think that Hemingway is the best fucking writer. A lot of people really celebrate his prose, and I think his prose is serviceable. I mean, it gets the job done. It's very sparse in a lot of ways. I just don't care for it. I don't know. Hemingway is typically pretty boring. I don't know why people flock to him so much. Hemingway himself was, of course, in World War I, right? He was an ambulance driver in World War I, and that definitely shows in his work, and of course specifically in A Farewell to Arms, which, follows the main protagonist, fucking Frederick Henry, I think? Hold on, I took notes on this shit. Yeah, you see, that's how much I liked the book. I actually had to write down the protagonist's name to make sure I could remember him or any of the other people, because I just generally didn't care for this book very much at all. Frederick Henry is a World War I ambulance driver on the front, because, that's the character that we follow in the book, and that's who Hemingway himself was in reality. From what I understand, he failed to actually get into the armed service, so he joined as an ambulance driver. Farewell to Arms seems to be fairly autobiographical in that way. A lot of his books seem to be autobiographical, or at least to my understanding they kind of are, if they're not directly autobiographical. I already mentioned Frederick Henry, the protagonist of the book. He's the one that's actually telling you the entire story. It's first person from his point of view. He suffers an injury while he's out and about doing his whole ambulance driving thing, and gets sent to the hospital where he falls in love with Catherine Berkeley, his nurse. And you can't really talk about Henry without speaking about Berkeley. Catherine and Frederick are both intertwined. That's obviously what the book's about. The book is really about their romance, and their romance in the face of this fucking war. Now, I'm not a romance guy. I don't give a shit about most romance stories. My wife has dragged me into a couple of romance films. I'm fine with romance as a subplot, but when it comes to when romance is the entire thrust of the book, or at least the majority of the thrust of the book, it's really hard to sell me. The only reason I was able to get through this book, which is mostly a romance between Catherine and Frederick, it was only because this book was a classic, and because I was curious why other people wanted to read this book, and why they got into it. And I can kind of understand why now, after I've read it. I just didn't like it. I didn't care for it. The only other characters that I even want to remark about would be Rinaldi, who would probably be my favorite character in the book. I actually smiled quite a bit when he was on the page. He got me to laugh a number of times while he was hanging around. I don't know, Rinaldi, baby. I actually liked him. You see, I'm smiling, going back and thinking about it. I didn't have to check my notes to see what his name was, because I remembered Rinaldi. Rinaldi was, all of the characters were pretty well written, but Rinaldi was the only one that actually stood out amongst any of them in the entire book. He's the only one that I would have loved to have followed longer. Everyone else, I'm kind of glad that the book ended already, because I just didn't care too much. I also remember the priest. I can't remember if the priest had a name or not, and I don't feel like looking it up right now at the moment, but the priest seemed to be a pretty okay character. I remember a few of the conversations that he and Henry had. There were only a few moments that actually stuck out to me. I'm not much of a romance guy, and if you don't care for romance, then this is probably probably not going to be your book either. There were very few things that I really feel like I'm going to carry with me and remember. I do remember Henry's injury. There was the large explosions and stuff, and a couple of his buddies died and stuff. That was a pretty well-written section, especially in comparison to the rest of the book. There's very little action that does happen, which, that's fine. Not every book has to be heavy on action. I read Mother Night by Kurt Vonnegut, and same thing with, The Catcher in the Rye. Both of those are excellent, but not intense on the action whatsoever. And Farewell to Arms actually did have a little bit of action when it came to the injury sequence. It also had another good moment of some action when Henry has to escape from, the Italian military police or some such. They end up capturing a bunch of people, including Henry, and they're starting to execute people left and right because, they're getting all paranoid about the Italians losing the war. And then, of course, then there was the end of the book, the very last bit of the book. I was enjoying A Farewell to Arms until I got to the last, 10 pages. The last 10 pages fucking killed it for me. Yeah, Catherine dies, and the baby is stillborn, and Henry goes back to the hotel, and we don't even get, any kind of emotional closure. Hemingway was part of the Lost Generation. He was in the Lost Generation. He was in World War I itself. And a lot of people, the whole fucking world was affected by World War I. Everybody kind of felt a little bit like Henry, or was Catherine by the end of the book. They were either dead, or they felt completely decimated inside, like everybody they've ever known and loved has kind of died around them, and that the world would never be the same. So I understand that. I just don't fucking like it. Ernest Hemingway decided to come over and just punch us in the fucking face with the end here, which, can't say it's wrong, It's effective. It's obviously getting an emotional reaction out of me. Fuck you, Ernest Hemingway. We're almost, I think we're about 60 years, or 60 some odd years past Ernest Hemingway's death, and he's still getting, at least me, to get pissed off about it. So, clearly, he's done his job at least a little bit. I'm a bit torn for how I want to rate this book because, personally, I did not like the way that it ended. I enjoyed the book enough to give it, a pretty straight C down the middle. I don't think it deserves to be called an all-time classic, especially not compared to some other works that are out there. I guess I just don't understand Ernest Hemingway in total, or I just don't like him. Or perhaps both, right? That seems fairly reasonable to me. Surprise, I'm gonna sell you shit. I may not be a beloved classic of American literature, but I am an American writer. I have The Circus, an American fantasy. This book is about creepy clowns and circuses and how capitalism is gonna come and destroy everything that you've ever loved. If you would like to read about that, just go check the description. I've also got Portraits in Bloodlines. This is 23 short stories, half of which I wrote, the other half my father wrote. There's horror, slipstream, a little bit of science fiction, something for everyone in Portraits in Bloodlines. Check the description for links to both books. There's Mad Monster Party in Arizona, July 12th to July 14th. If you drop on by, just come say hello, and I'd be happy to get you one of these books in person. Okay, yeah, that's the end. Bye.
Mayday, mayday, we're going down.